Hello, everyone. Today is September 2nd, 2020. Welcome to the bi-monthly React Storefront update. I am Ishan, MoveWeb CTO. With me here is Senior Architect Richard, who's going to take us through today's set of updates. Take it away, Richard.
All right, thank you very much. So today, we've got a few improvements to talk about for React Storefront, and then we're actually going to do a session talking about connectors and APIs as they relate to data and how data gets into React Storefront and how it's used in React Storefront. So specifically, we're talking about version 8.16.2, and let's go ahead and get started with those improvements. So the new version of React Storefront now trims and removes white space from all CSS when in production mode. This will obviously help reduce the size of style sheet assets, but it should also improve performance. And if you're building for AMP, it'll help you stay under that style sheet size limit. And I actually have a few demos of these, but I'll do all the demos at the end. I'll talk about them first. The second point here is we got our accessibility score back up to 100%. Over the last few updates to React Storefront, the search field component got some new features, which caused us to drop below 100%, but this has now been fixed. And lastly,
sorry, just to be clear, that's as measured by Lighthouse, correct?
Absolutely. Yep. And we're actually going to see that in just a second. Thank you, Sean. So lastly, the point here for the mock connector, bundled into the actual mock connector bundled into React Storefront had a bug just on the add to cart API endpoint, which was causing Next.js to throw an error. So this issue has been fixed, and that mock API endpoint has been updated a bit. Some of the props were a little off, so that's been fixed now. Okay, so what I wanted to show really quick was so I just wanted to show that accessibility score right here running on demo.reactstorefront.io. I went ahead and ran the accessibility lighthouse score, just showing that here. And as far as the style sheets, you can now see that these are all nice and minimized. All right, back to here. Okay, so now that we've gone through the improvements, let's talk about getting data into React Storefront. So we know we've talked about connectors in the past, but today we'd really like to explain how they work. Okay, so the React Storefront team recommends using what I'm calling paired API and page routes. So these abstract away consuming the data and rendering the data in your app, okay? So in this way, your page component can be in charge of rendering your page in a pure way, and the API endpoint can be in charge of fetching and transforming that data. So let me jump into our documentation, and let's go to managing state. So I want to show you these two code examples here. So React Storefront has some built-in helper functions, which are essentially the glue for these 2 points of the pair that I'm talking about. So as you can see in these two code examples, on this top one here, this is a page component in a Next application, a React Storefront application. So the page's get initial props is being set here. It's using our fetch from API function, which fetches the data as needed from the paired API endpoint. Okay, so essentially what this means is the path /p, I don't have it written out here, but like if you had a path, a route rather, /p/ with an ID parameter, that would collect its data from the built-in next route for /API/P/parameter ID. So essentially, it's just matching that route to its prefixed API endpoint. So that's what's happening.
Richard, just because
Yep.
a visual helps, under using an API in that section, the last line of that
Yes.
first paragraph, in the first paragraph underneath the heading, using the API, the last line of that paragraph.
Oh, yep. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yep.
has that example.
Absolutely. Thank you. That should help a lot. So these two routes is what I'm talking about. The page route here, and then the API route. Thank you, Sean. Yeah. So, okay. And what I'm saying here is this is what happens by default when you're using fetch from API. But we realize this is not, it's not a perfect world, and we can't always get it. You can't always collect the data from this route. So you can customize this path as needed, or if needed, rather. And a really good example of this is when you need to render maybe like a dynamic fallback page. So if you have multiple pages that all fall under one route, you can actually pass the as path property to the fetch from API function. And that is documented in our API reference for the docs here. So I just wanted to point that out. So we talked about on the page level. Now, like I said, this fetch from API will automatically go talk to the API endpoint. So now we're going to talk about how to implement the API endpoint. So the API endpoint needs to use our fulfill API request. So this function decides what data the app needs automatically, okay? And you can see the two different levels of data here. So there's always app level data and page level data. So to maybe help understand this, if an example here is maybe on a page's first load, when you're loading that page for the first time, the client obviously will need both the app level data and the page level data. But if a user is just navigating around the site, they already have that app level data, and when they go to a new page, the application only needs to request the page level data for that new page that they're about to go to. So I hope that makes sense. Now, this is how your data is consumed by React Storefront, but where does that data come from? Okay, so you could technically just fetch the data from the API endpoints themselves. So essentially, just right above this line here, you could just do a fetch to any API that you need server side. That totally works. Or of course, you could use a pre-built connector that we provide, or you can use a custom React Storefront connector. Okay, so for those of you who are interested in building your own connector, we wanted to point you to the documentation and show you some examples of how this can be accomplished. So we'll jump into the connectors documentation here, and we'll scroll down a little bit to creating your own connector. So at a high level, it's really quite simple. So essentially, you would just implement our connector interface by fetching the data needed, transforming it, and returning that data for each one of these endpoints. So now let's actually see that. Let's actually see that happening. So I've brought up a couple tabs. So we're going to look at our mock connector, which populates
Richard,
the data.
Yep. Could we go back to that previous tab for a second?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, click on the link to the connector interface. I just want people to see that. Yeah, click on that.
Yep. Here we go.
And then I want people to just see, those are the methods. So on that right, or right there under index, those are the properties: add to cart, cart, home, product, product slots. But like, those are all the methods that something needs to implement. And then if you go back to the previous tab that you were on in the docs, yeah, that's where, you know, the NPM module that this is pulled from is actually exporting the implementation of each of those functions, which are all in those subfiles. But that's basically all you're doing is you're implementing a method for each one of these listed methods in the interface. Sorry, keep going.
No, you're totally fine. Absolutely correct. So now we're just going to look at a couple implementations of this interface. We're going to start with a pretty easy one, which is the mock connector. That's actually a great connector to base. If you're creating a custom connector, you can just download this mock connector and just work from this when you're implementing your own connector. So this mock connector populates the data for our demo store here, if you wondered. So that's where all of this data is coming from. So we're just going to look at one of the endpoints for the connector, and that is the product endpoint. And so I just wanted to show you some of these pieces of code that we talked about before, you know, in action. Okay, so we're obviously using this fulfill API request, and for the app level data, we have a create app data function. So this is a common method that we use when we're getting our app level data in really any connector that we're writing. And what I mean by this is you're going to have a lot of endpoints that are going to share this create app level data, because almost always each of the pages are going to use the same app level data. So what we normally do is just pull that out, abstract it into another function, and then just reference it here. Okay, so this is just a promise that resolves the app level data here. And that way the fulfill API request can call this as needed, like we talked about before. Okay, and below here is this function here, get page data. This is implemented here, and this just creates some not randomized product data, but just some product data that is specific to the query string that is being passed in. So as you can see, the ID is being passed in here from the parameters of this next application. Okay, from the request, the URL level parameters. So a product data is being created here and transformed into page level data. And there's just some random transformations that are happening here. So this is what the mock connector looks like. Now let's look at a more real world use case. So this tab is the implementation of the product endpoint for the Salesforce Commerce Cloud connector. Okay, so I'm just going to run you through. It's actually almost looks simpler because it kind of is, because we don't have to create like mock out all this data. The data is just there. We just have to consume that data and then normalize that data. So on line 11 here, this is actually where we're calling to the Salesforce APIs and getting the raw product data for this particular ID. And we get the raw category ID as well. Or I'm sorry, the raw category data for this particular product's information. You won't always have to call both of these functions, obviously. This is just as you need to call the APIs for your particular application. So once we get that data, we have to normalize that data. So I can show you this normalization method here. Show it to you details. So we're normalizing the product. So this is just, you're going to see this in almost all the connectors, and it's very common across when you're creating connectors. The product data is going to come in from the APIs, and then you're going to normally need to massage that data a little bit to get it prepared for rendering. Okay, so as soon we essentially want to do all of that normalization and transformation so that our page rendering method doesn't have to do any of that. We just want it to consume that data and just throw it on the page, just render it on the page. So I was just showing you this, it's a bit long normalization method here that pulls in the data from Salesforce and builds this product object. Okay. Okay, and those are the two implementations of the product endpoint for the React connector interface. Now, so once again, to bring this all back, the data is being fetched, normalized, and transformed into the app or page level data for your application. It's important to note, though, that these normalizations were, specifically in these connectors we showed, were specific for the React Storefront starter app, okay? So obviously, you can normalize and transform the data just as you need for your own application, especially when you're creating your own custom connector. So after building out the endpoints, just like Ishan mentioned, once you build all your endpoints that the application needs, you just need to publish this connector and connect it to your React Storefront application, which is also documented here at the top of the connector page. You can see here in the next configuration. This is where you pass in your connector, whether it's a pre-built connector or a custom connector. And that's pretty much it. That's how you build a custom connector. So that's pretty much all I have, Ishan.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Just kind of to sum up at the top level, we showed you the last few, weeks and months, two connectors that came out. Those are both open source. Magento connector and the Salesforce Commerce Cloud connector. Use the tutorial here along with those open source connectors as examples to help you guide writing your connector for your particular platform if that's what you want to do. Let's go to Q&A. And a reminder, you can put questions in the chat. So first question coming in is, do I need to implement all of the interface methods for the connector interface?
That's a really great question. And the quick answer is no. You only need to implement what your app is going to use. If you create a site based on our React Storefront starter application, then it will assume that your connector has implemented all of the interface methods. So if you're basing your application if you're building your application off of our starter, it's probably a good idea to implement as much of those as you can. But of course, if you just don't have some of those features, then you can just leave those out and remove them from the starter application.
Okay, next question. Do I have to use a React Storefront connector to use React Storefront?
Quick answer, no, of course not. Writing or using a connector is typically appropriate for someone looking to build multiple sites on the same platform. But if you're building a single storefront, you can just connect to the normal API endpoints by editing that API route directly, and no connector is needed. So that's it for that question.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have for today, and we're almost at time. So Richard, thank you for answering the questions and today's walkthrough. We will all talk to you in 2 weeks.
All right, thank you very much.